Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired justice of the New York State Supreme Court. Running is a big word. Some folks run for the finish line in a marathon. Other folks run for the border. Other folks run for cover. Some run for their lives. Well, I ran for public office in 2001. As a member and director and two-time president of a local community organization, the Jackson Heights Beautification Group, I came to the conclusion that the best way to serve my community in the future was to seek public office, because so many of the things that people need in a community, healthcare, security, sanitation, electricity, you name it, stoplights, whatever it is, depends on the largesse of public servants and also public funding. And the best way to do that was to be yourself in public office. And I was tired of going to public officials and asking for help. And if I was a public official, I figured I could help myself in the community without doing it indirectly, a little more directly, a little more effectively. Well, anyway, like any undertaking, there's a good side and a bad side. And elective politics, it can be, at any level, can be pretty nasty stuff. And it could be, a pretty dirty game at worst. Because as a candidate, you put yourself up to public scrutiny, and there are many people out there who are more than willing to find fault in anything you do and anything you say. They're out there. A lot of fault finders around. And I thought about it, and I had no children, so I wasn't going to be exposing any kids to bad publicity about their dad or anything like that. My wife, on the other hand, who was very basically quiet and reserved and a private person, she didn't like the whole idea, but she went along. She was gracious and supported me. Her problem with politics was very simple. She said she could never master the art of being nice to people she didn't like. And I couldn't blame her, but that wasn't so bad. The other side of thing about politics that's a downside is the fact that you have to go out and depend on a lot of other people for help and for funding. And people basically are divided into two groups, givers and takers. Generally speaking, I'm a giver. I have trouble asking for help. I certainly have trouble asking anybody for money. It's just not my nature. But if you want to run for office, you need plenty of help and you need plenty of money. You can't do it on your own unless you're independently wealthy, which I wasn't by any stretch of the imagination. So the other thing is, you're going to go and you're going to win. Winning is easy. If you win, everybody loves you. Success has 1,000 fathers. Failure is an orphan. But when you fail, you're putting your ego on the line, and you need a thick skin to withstand all the criticism you're going to get, and then you need a strong mind to handle the fact that you're going to lose, or when you lose. I didn't have a problem too much with anything in that nature. So weighing all the pluses and minuses, I still went ahead, and thankfully, New York City has a matching fund proposition. The New York City Campaign Finance Board. You can sign up with them. And you have to follow very strict procedures and detailed rules. And if you do that and you raise the money correctly, you small donors, et cetera, and you account for everything in minute detail, you can get 3-to-1 at that time. There were 3-to-1 matching funds. Any money you raised up to a certain point could be matched threefold by the city. Now, that was pretty good. Question was, how are you going to go about doing that? And rich candidates avoided that. All the strictures in their campaign because they self-funded, they paid for their own campaigns. But in my race, there was no problem of that nature. I figured out a way to raise funds, and I had, for 2 years preceding my decision to run for election, I had operated a cafe. I was not only an attorney with a private law practice in the Jackson Heights neighborhood, but I ran a cafe called Cafe Greco, and named after the famous cafe in Rome of the same name, starting from the 1600s. And on Tuesday nights at Cafe Greco, to boost business, I would have music, live music. And it went from 7 to 9 p.m. because we were in a building where we had residences right above the street level storefronts. So I didn't want to disturb the neighbors, and they didn't want to be disturbed. And the musicians were amateurs, very talented amateurs, or up and coming professionals who were eager to play before live audiences, and even in small venues, it didn't matter. And they were happy to have the exposure, and I was happy to have them there. And it was good for the musicians, and it was good for business, and it was good for the audience because everybody enjoyed it. These people were very competent. And what I would do, they would play two 45-minute sets with a half-hour intermission. After the first set, from 7 to 7:45 p.m., I would pass the hat personally and collect money from the audience. And then I would feed the musicians in the half-hour intermission, and they'd play a second set, and I would repeat the process. I didn't have to feed them twice, but I did collect money twice by passing the hat. And almost invariably, we had a nice pot of collected funds, and the musicians appreciated it. And if it was an off night, by virtue of the fact of maybe a Tuesday night was bad weather, or it was a holiday, or there was a big ball game on, or some other intervening factor, and the pot wasn't sufficient, I would add to it to make sure that the musicians got a fair shake and walked out with a night's pay. And they were very happy about that. Well, that stood me in good stead, because when it came time for me to run for election, I decided I was going to run some concerts. And the musicians that I had supported over the last 2 years came forward with flying colors. They were delightful. They were so happy to help. They all volunteered their talents at no cost to me. So I rented a local school auditorium and set up three different fundraising concerts. And we charged everybody a modest fee of the entrance at $25 a piece, saying it was to support my candidacy. And at intermission, we would serve the people either cider or white wine, cookies or cheese, and it was everybody loved it. One of the local people who was himself an elected official was deputy borough president, a guy named Peter Magnani, had been to a million fundraisers, and he told me, he said, "Rudy, I hate fundraisers." He said, "But he said, you put the fun back in fundraising." He said, "And I enjoy coming. He said, if you did this every week, I'd be here." And he says, and it's great because the people got their money's worth, and I was not obligated. They got something for what they paid, and I didn't feel overly obligated. And I certainly wasn't under the thumb of some big donor who then wanted to tell me what to do with my services in public office. So I thought that was pretty good stuff. The next problem was volunteers. Well, because I had a local law practice, because I had the cafe, and because I was the head of a big local community improvement organization, I had no problem getting volunteers. So many nice people stepped up to help. The problem wasn't in listing numbers of people. The problem was organizing those people, because you can't impose on them. And then you want to organize them utilizing, optimally their talents and the time that they're available. They're not all available at the same time, and everybody's got a different proposition. So getting that all straightened out was pretty important and pretty involved. Although it was positive, and the troops came from all over the neighborhood, and they worked their tails off with smiles on their faces. How lucky could I be? My campaign treasurer was a business whiz, a guy named Chris Ankner. He had a firm where he sold municipal bonds and other bonds, and he was very, very bright. A lot of times with public funding, at the end of the campaign, candidates would find themselves in deep financial trouble. They owed money or were fined for abusing the rules. Some of them owed hundreds of thousands of dollars after their campaign, some citywide campaigns. Others got fined spectacularly for different violations. Mine was so clean under Chris's supervision that at the end, when we had a reckoning, and we had a final reckoning before the campaign finance board going over every detail in the finance, we ended up owing $14. So that was pretty good. I was pretty happy. They were pretty happy. We were all pretty happy. That was it. I had to refund $14 out of all the money, and we maxed out because of all the concerts. We got the maximum matching funds. And by the way, I also, among the volunteers, I might add, I had a couple, a husband and wife, Jim and Renee Stonebreaker, who both were designers at Tiffany, and I wrote the copy, but they designed all my campaign literature, which was really first class, and it was delightful. So the whole thing about volunteers was working out very, very well. But like many first time office seekers, I managed my own campaign, and that was a big mistake. In retrospect, I hated the idea of going door to door canvassing. I viewed it personally as a big upset of people's dinner time, and because that's when you catch them home. And I hated the idea of making calls, cold calls to strangers. Personally, I really deeply resented those methods, and I should have done them, but I didn't. Okay, but there's no substitute for talking to people and asking for their votes because you have to do that. I did go out to all the public places, meetings, associations, church organizations, street corners, supermarkets, libraries, the subway stops in the morning at rush hour and in the evening at rush hour. And I did that. And I did that assiduously, and I went out. I enjoyed it, shaking hands. I did love meeting the people, and it was an eye opener. And our district is probably the most diverse in the world because it included parts of Jackson Heights, Corona, Elmhurst, Rego Park, and Woodside. And I met all kinds of people of every persuasion and race and ethnicity. And in general, I found the Asians, the Chinese, the Filipinos, Tibetans, Nepalese, South Asian Indians, Vietnamese, to be the most receptive and cheerful people, even early in the morning or late at night while they were rushing. They were always very, very nice. Right behind them, nearly as good, and just a slight difference, were blacks and Latinos as a group. They were terrific. They were always polite and receptive. The worst and the grumpiest were white people. Well, say la vie, and I'm being general in nature, So there were a lot of exceptions to that. So we had a lot of fun hitting the streets. And I'll tell you about a couple of incidents that were remarkable. The first one, we were campaigning on a Sunday morning at a shopping center in Lefrak City in nearby Corona. And I had two older women volunteers who were working the street with me, handing out pamphlets while I was shaking hands, et cetera, et cetera. And they were getting a little upset because you couldn't hear yourself talking because there was a young black fellow, a young guy, maybe he's in his early 20s, and he was a Rasta. I say that because he had dreadlocks, and in the heat of the summer, he was wearing this big knit cap, which was black, green, yellow, and red. Right out of the Jamaican handbook. And he had a boombox, and he's playing reggae music loud as could be. And he's standing right there, so we couldn't even hear ourselves talk. And I didn't mind so much, but the ladies were getting upset. So I decided to do something, and I approached the guy, but I did it with a smile in a nice, mild-mannered way. And I motioned. I gave him a hand signal, like pointing to the boombox with twisting my wrist, like, "Can you shut that off?" And I guess because I did it in a nice way, he looked. He turned it down. I think he might have even shut it off. And he looked at me quizzically, like, what did I want? So I walked over to him. And I was 6 inches from him, and I started singing, "By the rivers of Babylon," which is the first line in a classic reggae song, one of the very first reggae songs. The guy looked up in delight, and we started singing together a duet, the entire song. And when we finished, he was laughing, I was laughing, and I said, "Could you please either move down the block or turn down the boombox, because the ladies can't hear themselves?" Well, he looked at me, he smiled, he walked away, he turned down the volume, and he was walking down the block to another corner in the far distance, bobbing his head to the reggae beat, and that was it. And it worked out really, really well. Another day was a hazy, hot, and humid day. And because you're campaigning is a primary election in September, you're campaigning in the middle of the summer, which is no fun. And people are not in a political mood either. And New York, when it's hazy, hot, and humid, is pretty uncomfortable. And I'm at a subway station, very crowded subway station. And people, I'm trying to talk to people before they descend into the bowels of the subway, where it's going to be worse than it is out on the street. So nobody's in a particularly good mood. And I see coming toward me this handsome middle-aged Latin woman, and I tried to approach her and hand her a pamphlet and introduce myself and ask for her vote. And she intercepts me and cuts me off and says, "Listen, save your breath. I don't believe in politicians, okay? I don't believe in them. And she was so brusque, and I guess, I don't know, my reaction was instantaneous. I didn't even think about it. I said, okay, you don't believe in politicians, so the next time you need the garbage cleaned up on your street, or you need the police to patrol your block, or you need a street light that went out repaired, or a stoplight, or a stop sign, you should call the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus, all right? Because maybe you believe in them. Well, she didn't like that, but I felt good, all right? And that helped me to feel a little better about myself. And the last incident I'm going to talk about was kind of fun. And I just found out I was working again, another subway stop. And I had just found out that day that I had been endorsed. My candidacy had been endorsed by the New York Times. So I'm feeling pretty full of myself. You know, the New York Times. All right. Didn't matter that nobody in Jackson Heights was reading the New York Times. And I also was endorsed by the Citizens Union just shortly before that. And that didn't matter either. But it made me feel good. And I'm still proud of the fact that I was endorsed by them both. In any event, we're trumpeting that, my volunteers and I, and we're telling people as they pass by, and we're handing out, vote for Rudy Greco, endorsed by the New York Times. So this elderly gentleman comes over to me and he says, "Are you the candidate?" I says, "Well, I got the tie on. What do you think?" He says, "All right, I got it." He said, "Okay, I'm going to tell you something." He said, "I'm old." He said, "You endorsed by the Times?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, don't let it go to your head." He says, "Because I'm going to tell you, I've been around a long time, and I remember when the New York Times endorsed Hitler. And another time, they endorsed Stalin. So don't get carried away." I said, "All right, thank you." That sort of put everything in perspective. Well, primary day finally arrived, and it was September 11th, 2001. And it was a perfect, cloudless, warm, late summer day. And my team was at polling places from 6 a.m. all over the neighborhood. I myself included, and my wife. We were at the busiest polling place in the neighborhood, which was a junior high school, right across the street from apartment complexes with called the Towers, which at the top of the sixth floor, they were like Tuscan-style architecture. They had a tower, just like you see in Tuscany, and up there was a neighbor. While we're handing out pamphlets on the ground, at ground level, this guy was up there, and at around 9 a.m., he shouts down, "Oh my God! Oh my God! A plane just hit the Trade Center." And he comes running down, and he had a digital camera with a telephoto lens, and he had binoculars too. And he said, look at this shot." And he showed us the shot of the plane and the building smoking, the Trade Center, the first impact. And I thought to myself, "Oh, this is probably some poor pilot had a stroke or passed out or a heart attack or something like that, lost control, and the plane collided. It's a terrible disaster." So the guy went right back upstairs to his vantage point, and just minutes later, he starts screaming, "Oh no, again, another plane." And I said, "Oh my God, this is World War III." They closed the polls down. We went home. My wife and I turned on the TV set in the kitchen, made coffee because we hadn't had anything since 6 o'clock in the morning, and that was just after 9. And my wife were looking at the thing in awe at the television coverage. And my wife says, "It's a good thing these buildings are so strong." Well, as soon as she said that, the first tower started to collapse. And boy, oh boy, was that grim. That was terrible. Well, the good news about 9/11 was that 3 of my volunteers worked at the Trade Center, or they passed through the Trade Center going to their offices, and they were home that day. They took the day off kindly, very generously, to work on the campaign and campaigning. So they weren't there, and they may very well have been in the building or through when it collapsed. The sad part was another client of mine and a neighbor, a young fella, a firefighter named Sergio Villanueva, died in the collapse of the one tower. Sergio had been an undercover cop. He came from Argentina as a young man, and he was a policeman, and he hated the job because he was undercover in narcotics, and it was a slimy job. He hated it, and he was so happy when he transferred to the fire department, and he was in his second year of a 2-year probation, and he was in Crown Heights, coming off shift when the alarm sounded about the Trade Center. Everybody on his truck climbed back on the truck, headed for the Trade Center, headed for Manhattan, went over the Brooklyn Bridge, went to the Trade Center, and the last anybody ever heard of Sergio and his unit was when they were ascending from the 65th floor. That was the last communication. And he's a fine-looking, beautiful guy. Had just gotten engaged. His fiancée and he just bought a little business for her, a gift shop in Jackson Heights. They had a brand new lease and stock on a co-op apartment. It was the most tragic thing. It was a heartbreaking proposition. Well, anyway, the election itself was postponed for weeks, and I didn't win. I had two competitors in the election, and one of them was a longtime Democratic female district leader who had paid a lot of dues in the community. She had been there and a long time, and she was backed by the mighty Queens County Democratic Organization, which is probably, arguably, the most powerful local county organization in the country in the Democratic Party. So they're pretty formidable. The other opponent I consider to be a carpetbagger because I never saw the guy in the neighborhood, never knew of him. I knew everybody in the neighborhood. And he was an openly gay guy. He worked for the library system. And to give him his due, he worked very, very hard. He took off for the whole summer. He knocked on doors, which I didn't do. He made phone calls, which I didn't do. He was out there full time, which I wasn't. And he was openly gay, so I had quite a gay clientele in my law practice, which is native to Jackson Heights anyway. And what had happened with his candidacy, he and I divided the opposition, split the opposition to the woman, and she was able, because we split the opposition, to win election. Well, okay, c'est la vie. That's how things go, you know. I never liked the other guy, but I sent a large congratulatory bouquet when she won. Well, I was sorry about the result, but not so much for myself, but more for my volunteers who put so much into it. And I asked them, but they had worked so hard, and the effort didn't come out as we wished, and that's what bothered me more than anything else. So, a short time after the election, maybe 3 months after she took office, it was maybe early March, and she was my neighbor. We lived in the same complex of 12 buildings, 6 on one block and 6 sharing the same backyard, back to back. And I'm walking my dog. It was Sunday night, about 7 o'clock. I'm walking my dog around the block, and I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm going to go home, watch HBO, finish the New York Times, maybe have coffee with my wife. And my thoughts went ahead to the next morning, Monday, when I had to be in the office and what was laying ahead of me in the way of work to be done, when I come upon the newly elected councilwoman in her doorway, all dressed up on Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And I said, my goodness, what are you doing? She says, oh, I'm waiting for my son. He's going to drive me. I have to go to a meeting. I said, you got to go to a meeting Sunday night? Yes. Oh. And I said, well, that's why you get the big bucks, kid. Good luck. And I thought to myself, whoa, are you lucky you're not going to any of those things? And then a couple of weeks after that, an old neighbor of mine, a great gentleman, Joe O'Brien, and Joe was a court clerk. And Joe motions me. He's got the cigarette dangling out of his mouth, walking up the block, and he motions me like with his hand to come and across the street to where he was. And of course, out of respect, I did it, and friendship. I know Joe a long time. And the first words, he didn't say hello. The first words out of his mouth was, "You're lucky." I said, "Joe, what are you talking about?" He said, "The election." I said, "Joe, I lost the election. How do you figure I'm lucky? I tried to win." He said, "Well, if you won the election, you'd be the city councilman, and every kook in the neighborhood would be on the phone or bothering you on the street with complaints about overflowing garbage cans and street lights and police protection and every other issue, noisy neighbors and every other thing in the world. You're a lawyer. Go be a judge like my brother." He said, "What are you wasting your time with the city council? Who needs that?" And you know what? He was probably right. I said, he's got a point there. Well, the windup is, years later, I did become a district leader myself, Democratic Party district leader. And subsequently, I ran and was elected to the New York City Civil Court and the New York State Supreme Court, eventually. Lucky me. And it was terrific. I've had a wonderful career. And, it brings to mind the words of the famous rock song. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you may get what you need. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.